Welcome everybody to Chaps Many Cultures, episode 189 on this beautiful Friday, Spring Friday. I hope it's spring somewhere where you are. And thank you for joining us and thank you for watching. Today, a very, very special guest, as we promised yesterday, to talk about how early experiences can really form and inspire you to really create the inclusive atmosphere around the world, not just locally, but around the world. And we promise you our guest is one of the best to speak to this. So stick around. It's going to be great. Here we are back again, the #1 show of the culture of business and the business of culture, episode 189. As I said, two chaps, many cultures. How are you today, pal?
Happy Friday. I'm doing extra fantastic. And
Wonderful.
Yes, it is spring where I am. I hope spring is where you are. Maybe it is where you are. Some of you might be watching on the other side of the globe where it's not spring, but we'll include you anyway, because this is, again, another episode where we want to be intentionally inclusive.
Absolutely.
And when I heard that we're going to have a guest like we have today, especially this gentleman whom I've heard speak before and who has, well, let's say a personal history that a lot of people around the world should be hearing about, I was very excited. So I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'm going to let you bring him on, Brett. You know this gentleman a little bit better than I do, so you do us the honor.
Oh, absolutely. Welcome, Mr. Elmer Dixon, to the Two Chaps Many Cultures world global stage. How about that? We're not bloviating. We're just absolutely just putting ourselves above any station. Welcome, sir. How are you?
I'm good. And thank you for having me.
Very good. Thank you. And as I said, you know, we've got the topic of intentional inclusion, which you so wonderfully express in your work. And but of course, that comes from, just like all cultures do, and all influences do, come from early childhood. So I want to dig right into that, because I don't want to steal, again, like Kristen says, we don't want to steal your thunder, because your story is really fascinating, and it's one that kind of follows the arc of social justice here in the US in a really influential way. But also you're doing this and using that message on the world stage. So let's go back to your upbringing, because I've heard you talk about your early experiences as a child, you know, really being involved in a lot of cultures. I mean, and being exposed to a lot of cultures, which is very interesting, right?
Yeah, you know, and Brett, a lot of the things that we experience growing up, we have no idea, obviously, most of them, we have no idea how they're going to influence us, you know, years later, you know, how they shape us. You know, I don't think that ever comes to mind. I don't recall it coming to mind, because I had certain ideas about what I wanted to do when I did grow up. One was to be a doctor, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I was also, for me, I think, fortunate to grow up during the era in which I grew up, the civil rights era and the birth of the Black Power movement, all of which had a significant impact on my life. I was born in 1950 in Chicago, and spent my first couple of years on this planet living with my grandmother, while my parents moved to Champaign because my mother was pregnant with her 4th child. And so my grandmother was, you know, giving her a break from, you know, from a 2-year-old running around the house. And in 1955, Emmett Till was brutally murdered. And he actually was from the same neighborhood in which I was living with my grandmother, in the neighborhood my dad grew up in. And my dad wrote a poem, a very moving poem, brutal, about the brutal existence of this young man and how he met his end. And I don't obviously remember reading the poem or hearing the poem when I was 5. I'm sure we were exposed to it in some way. I read it years later, but that was as the civil rights movement was unfolding. When the bus boycott, and Rosa Parks, whom I would meet years later, all of that was unfolding. And we moved to Seattle in 1960, and my parents coming from the black south side of Chicago, into a housing project in Champaign, and from there out to the Pacific Northwest. And so the Pacific Northwest has always kind of been perceived as kind of the progressive, more liberal city, which to a certain degree it is. But there were more subtle things that were happening that as a child I wasn't really aware of, but my parents were. And so shortly after, that was in 1957. In 1960, they bought a home in Madrona, which is I refer to it as a melting pot community, because we lived across the street from the Madrona Park. And in that park, on any given weekend day or after school, the kids that were in that park were black, white, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, rich and poor whites. Because I say rich and poor because we lived on the edge of the red line. We didn't obviously know that our neighborhood was redlined at that time, but a block from us was the line, and a block from there, black folks couldn't even buy homes over there, nor could Asians or Latinos. And so we of course we had no idea of that. But two of my best friends, in fact, they were my two best friends, lived on the other side of the red line, and they were both white. And their homes were a little bit nicer. One of them even had a maid, and one of them was second generation Russian, which led me to his grandmother's house on occasion on Christmas to eat some of the funky desserts that she had prepared. But that was kind of part of the cultural experience that I was having. And my dad, and my mother, but my dad in particular had this, they had both taught us to always, as King used to say, judge a person by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. That was kind of who they were. And I remember my dad, on certain days, would have my brothers and I on our hands and knees, polishing the hardwood floors in the house. And while this was going on, he had Madame Butterfly playing, or La Boheme, or the Tales of Hoffmann. I mean, and he was the orchestra. He was the conductor, and he was conducting, while we were on the floor scrubbing, listening to La Boheme. And he's
Elmer, if I may, real quick, if I may interject real quick, because you made some references that 20 years ago, as an immigrant to this country, I would have not understood. So as I know that there are people watching who may not be too intimately familiar with U.S. history or certain parts of it, there were two references you made. One was to the brutal murder of Emmett Till, and then the concept of redlining, that I would like to at least briefly put some context around. So Emmett Till, at the time, I think when he was murdered, 14 years old or 15 years old, a black boy from the south side of Chicago who was, I think, further down south when he was
in Mississippi.
And he was accused of catcalling or interacting in a quote unquote inappropriate way with a white daughter of a white shopkeeper, and the girl accused him of making a move on him, which in a segregated South led to his conviction and eventually lynching, murder. And the lady, or the girl who accused Emmett Till later on in the final days of her life, admitted that she had lied, that she had made this up, and that kind of sparked the civil rights movement. Would that be a fair, short, compact version of retelling that story?
Well, yeah, I think that's a good compact version. He was 15 years old, and she accused him of winking at her, cat whistling at her.
Right.
And there was, when you say conviction, there was no trial. You know,
Yeah.
these are lynch mobs that were you know, I mean, they were rampant throughout the South. You know, post slavery, post Reconstruction.
Right.
The Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the Imperial Wizards, in their white robes, they began to right after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, to contain and strike fear in the hearts and minds of Black people, to keep them down, to keep them in check. Because slavery may have been outlawed, but racism and brutal oppression had not been.
Mm-hmm.
And so Emmett Till was just another in a long line of lynching and murders. I mean, Lynchville, Mississippi. You know, I mean, the lynching, that's the kind of the capital of Mississippi, and across the South, of course. And so here comes this young Black man out of Chicago, who had no idea what the South was like. It was a very dangerous place for a black person, period, but let alone someone from the North that didn't know how to, quote unquote, act. He may have looked at her, but she took it further, just because she didn't like the fact that he looked at her.
Right.
And so they tracked this guy and brutally murdered and chopped his body up, and you know, stomped him and just brutally murdered him, and threw his body in the river.
It was a torturing massacre, and
it was very
I think the fact that his mother refused to
gouge his eye out.
Yeah.
You know, and his mother, Mamie Till, during his funeral, left his casket open because she wanted the community to see what had been done to her son. And these people were never brought to trial. They never paid for their crime.
No.
And so, but that was part of the existence of the South. That was one example. And maybe that sparked the civil rights movement. But there were so many other acts of violence that had been occurring for decades. That may have been the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. But I don't want people to get the impression that this was a single event, because it was a pattern.
The most widely publicized event, and maybe the shock effect of the open casket photos that the mother wanted the world to see, right?
Yes.
Thanks for letting us clarify that. And redlining is the practice of, what was it, banking or mortgage companies or insurance companies, of dividing up certain areas in the city where they wanted to lend money to potential homeowners or didn't want to lend, right?
Yeah, but they actually conspired with the real estate agents as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the real estate agents were told not to sell homes to people of color, Black, particularly Black, Latino, and Asian, in these neighborhoods. And so the lenders would take a red pen, the ink, and redline where Blacks were allowed to purchase. And so it was to contain Blacks and Latinos and Asians into those neighborhoods. Any place else was off limits, you know. And that was a practice that historically in the United States really, and continues today, the impact of this practice continues to affect Black communities across the country. And when Blacks began to migrate, it was called the Great Migration North. When Blacks began to migrate out of the South, out of the Mississippi and the North Carolina and those racist states where you could be lynched for whistling or saying hello the wrong way, or looking at someone the wrong way. My grandfather was born in Mississippi, my mother's mother, and they had to get him out of town when he was 12 years old because he was defiant. He wasn't going to let somebody call him the N-word, a nigger. He wasn't going to kowtow, and they had to get him out when he was a young boy because they were afraid that he would get lynched. And so when Black people began to move out of the Great Migration, my grandparents were part of that migration. On my father's side out of Kentucky, on my mother's side out of Mississippi. And so whites began to leave the inner cities. It was known as white flight. And as they left the inner cities, the suburbs were created. But in order to create the suburbs, housing where there were no houses, the developers who wanted to help build these suburbs went to the federal government. And the federal government basically bankrolled and subsidized the building of these vast suburbs, but they also put in a charter in their lending that said no people of Negro descent, Negroid, Asiatic. They use these terms, and so while these white communities flourished and grew, because they had more income, they got the better schools. So their schools got funded, fully funded, while the inner city schools crumbled.
Right.
So Blacks were getting, and Latinos were getting substandard education. These white kids were getting the best education, which of course afforded them the right to go to the best schools, the Ivy League schools, and the top universities, while Blacks were funneled into community colleges if they could get there, or into labor jobs. This is a continuation of white dominance in our society.
So what you're describing is also the harsh reality of what northern states sometimes, or people who live in northern states in the United States often forget, is that the segregation, the white versus minority power distance and systemic control of power, it wasn't necessarily a Southern thing. The Southern states may have been the slaveholder states and the most overt in their racism and violence against minorities, especially Black people. But the systemic inequity and inequality persisted throughout the country, right? It's
throughout the country. Yes, it was rampant throughout the country. California. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, because I'm interested in that now. Like you described your experience of what I would call organic inclusion. You know, your friends and the kids that you grew up with were just diverse by their very nature, both socioeconomic and racial and heritage. And so when you kind of became aware of these across the country, like these inequities and across the country, is this what kind of led you? I'm kind of interested, as you heard these things coming in. Is this what led you into your?
Well, Brett, there was a point to the story that I was telling about the hardwood floors and the opera, because that weekend after we had got the floors all polished, my parents would invite their Scandinavian friends over, and they would do loud Scandinavian dancing and scuff up those floors that we had worked so hard to clean. But we as kids were watching them do this loud, jumping up and down and dancing with Scandinavian music. That was part of my cultural immersion, if you will. And so we happened to be in, and it wasn't just the fact that we were in this city where we had, you know, the opportunity for cultures to come together. It was because of my dad, who was out there making friends with people regardless of what they looked like. When he was 18 years old, when he turned 18, months after Pearl Harbor was bombed, he and his buddies signed up. They didn't wait for the draft. There was a draft, you know, to draft people into the army, into the military, because the Nazis had already marched across most of Europe, and now the United States was bombed in 1941, and so as soon as they turned 18, they went and signed up, and he got his assignment letter, and it said this little town, and then it had the initials MS at the end, and he thought he was going to Missouri. You know, I guess he wasn't really, high on his list was not geography, because he was an artist. He ended up being an artist. And so when he got on the troop train and they got off the train, they were in Mississippi. And so they were warned not to go off the base. And he was in an all black segregated regiment. In fact, there was a movie 10 or 15 years ago titled Glory, and it was about the first black infantry group, the Fighting 54th. Well, he was in that same infantry, the Fighting 54th. And so they trained there in basic training. There were a couple of riots in town because some of the black soldiers would leave and want to go in and have a drink, and white folks didn't want them in their bars drinking. And so there were some riots. And so when it came time to be shipped off to war, to go fight for this country and fight in the South Pacific, as they were marching through this little town, which is, you watch movies, heck, you see that in even foreign movies, you know, in Papillon, you know, when the soldiers were marching through Paris, you know, go off to fight, you know, the confetti's flying and the flags are waving and the people are cheering. So they're marching through this town to be transported off to war, and they were being spit upon. The feces were thrown at them. They were being called cowards and niggers, and this is how they were sent off to war, to fight for these people, to fight for this country, to fight for freedom. But I say that story because it never colored how he saw people. It never colored how he saw people. That experience did not stop him from seeking out people that were different. And so some of his friends that he had made were Jewish. And in fact, the people that sold us our house were Jewish. And so he had some friends that were Jewish, and we would go over their house for Passover. I had my first matzo ball when I was 12 years old. So it's like I'm getting me and my siblings were getting this baptism into what multicultural life was. We had no idea that's what was happening, but that's what was happening. That was the ground up experience from when we were very little, having this experience with all of these different cultures and all of these different backgrounds. One of my friends in the group of friends that I ran with, they were Japanese, and their parents had been interned here during World War II, and felt the brunt of American-made, homemade concentration camps. For those of you that aren't aware that are viewing this, when World War II broke out, U.S. citizens who were Japanese were herded into camps because they weren't trusted during the war that they would turn on, their own country. So they lost their businesses. Many of them lost their homes, and they were put in these internment camps during the war. Well, their parents, the 𝙾𝙬𝙤, his parents were in an internment camp, but Mr. 𝙾𝙬𝙤, his mother, 𝙈𝙬𝙤𝙦 who became very popular in the Black community as a teacher and as a school administrator, who always fought for the rights of and the needs of Black and people of color. But he used to teach us judo, and Mr. 𝙾𝙬𝙤 did. And then there was one of our group in our gang. It's like our gang comedy, the kids in the neighborhood. one of them, Kevin, his dad, he was a white guy. His dad was a boxer. And so he taught us how to box. And so, but it was this multicultural kind of learning environment that I grew up in. And an interesting thing happened, because I'm just kind of living life as a, we grew up in a era of assassinations. First John F. Kennedy when I was 13 years old, and that same year, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. For those of you that don't know about that event, 4 little girls were preparing for communion on a Sunday when a member of the Ku Klux Klan had placed dynamite in the church and blew it up and killed the 4 little girls. I remember seeing that, the aftermath of that on TV when I was 13 live. The parents crying and screaming because their kids were gone. Their babies were gone. They'd never see them again alive. The assassination of Medgar Evers, another civil rights leader. The assassination of the 3 civil rights activists who had traveled from the north, Cheney and a couple of them, I think, were Jewish, and the black guy who were chased down in Mississippi or Alabama and murdered and left on the side of the road.
Yeah, that's the story that Mississippi Burning was built on, the movie,
yes,
right? Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965, the explosion and they call them riots, but they were insurrections against of the worst kind of conditions that people were forced to live in Detroit, and in Watts. They weren't riots. They were rebellions. Whenever this government doesn't like something, they label it as a rebellion, or they label people as extremists, or they label people as terrorists, when this country has created more terrorism than just about any country on this planet. And so those were the times that I grew up in. And it was in 1967 that a guy by the name of Stokely Carmichael came to Seattle. And Stokely Carmichael was the head of an organization called SNCC, the acronym Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they had formed in the South and worked with the LCLC MLK's organization. In fact, I forgot to mention, I marched with Dr. King when I was 13 years old when he came to Seattle. And so they had worked with the SCLC in the South on voter registration, but they had grown. These were younger people, younger men and women. In fact, it was a black woman who started SNCC, and they had grown weary of these voter registration and these struggles where they saw they didn't see the change occurring. And the leader of SNCC prior to Stokely was a guy by the name of H. Rap Brown. And there's a famous poster of H. Rap Brown during that came out during the Watts and the Detroit rebellions, where he's got his afro on, similar to, I'm almost got my afro back now because of the pandemic. And he's got his dark shades on, and he's holding a match, and the caption reads "Burn, baby, burn." And so the young people in this country, young black people, were shifting. They were becoming conscious and aware of who they were, and that was the rise of the Black and I'm Beautiful movement and the Black Power movement. And so Stokely came to town. I was 17 years old, and Stokely was just as fiery as Rap was, and he spoke at my high school, Garfield, and the auditorium was overflowed, and there were people all in the streets and with loudspeakers because there were so many people that turned out to hear this cat speak. And I remember him saying that black people will never be free because you don't love yourselves. You hate the fact that you're black, and you want to be white. And he said, you straighten your hair, talking to the women, because you don't like your hair. And he said, if you read the Bible, and the Bible says that Jesus' hair was like sheep's wool, I remember him rubbing his hair and said, like sheep's wool. He was trying to, illustrate that it was like this. And he said that every depiction that you see of black is negative. And he gave several references that angel food cake is white, devil's food cake is black. The good cowboy wears white and rides a white horse named Trigger and wears a white 10-gallon hat. And the bad cowboy is always in black clothes with a black hat and rides a black horse, and he's called Dirty Bart.
Right.
The good knight in the movies rides a white horse in shining armor, and the bad knight is always in dark armor on a black horse. He gave several of these analogies. And I remember, that growing up, that on the playgrounds that we played on, if someone dared call me black, dared call you black, those were fighting words. Like, I ain't black. Well, you were black. No, well, I ain't black. And so everything was, was negative, about all of the negative connotations about black. And, when it didn't sink in right away. Because like I said, I had grown up in this multicultural environment, and I had my two best friends were white. Well, when I sat down on the tennis court, we lived across the street from the park, which had tennis courts, and we had learned how to play tennis. And it was a hot summer morning, and I remember thinking about what he said, and I remembered that when my mother went to get a job after we first moved here, that she had responded to an ad and called up to see if a job was available. And they said, please, yes, come on down. And so when she got there and she walked in the door, they said, excuse me, can we help you? She said, I'm here. I'm responding to the ad for the job. And they said, oh, well, that job is filled. I'm sorry. We have no more jobs. And so she said, she thought that was a little funny. So she left and went downstairs and pulled a dime out of her purse. Back then phone calls were 10 cents. She put a dime in the pay phone and called back up and said, excuse me, I'm calling about that job that's in the ad. Is that still available? And they said, oh, yes, it's still open. Come on up. And see, there's one of the stereotypes is that black people, of course, aren't educated. When you can tell a black person on the phone. Well, my mother was college educated, had gone to teachers college in Chicago. So they couldn't tell from her voice.
Yeah.
And when she walked back in the door, they said, excuse, why are you here? She said, well, I just called you and you said that job was still open. Now, she still didn't get the job, but she called them out on the carpet. And I remember that incident. And go ahead. You wanted to interrupt there, Chris.
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt you because I could listen to you all night with these stories, but I'm curious what the generational shift was. So, your father serving in the war after Pearl Harbor, he served in the Pacific arena. Many black soldiers for the U.S. military served in the European conflict, helping defeat Nazi Germany. There's even, if you watch the movie Mudbound, you get a clear idea of what that might have been like with Mary J. Blige.
The tank troops at the Battle of the Bulge were black.
Right.
That turned the tide of the war.
And black people, black American soldiers were seen as liberators in Europe. They for the first time in their lives, experienced a level of acceptance they hadn't known from at home. And after that, they come back to their rural communities in the segregated South just to be thrown back into the old soup, right? So this was your dad's reality. Now your reality is that of a awakening generation, boomer generation, with JFK, with all these incidents that you mentioned, and coinciding with the anti-Vietnam War movement that motivated a white population and aligned it with the interests of marginalized Black America to a certain degree, right, and created a bigger movement. How did that lead you to, with your multicultural or interactive upbringing in Seattle, how did it lead you into your role of activism? What changed for you that you said, I need to be part of this and be an agent of change in this?
Okay, so I'm going to go right back into my story.
Yeah,
because that's where I'm headed. So the other thing that I thought about was when our tennis team, right there at Madrona, we were all black players. we had won the right to play for the city championship. And we had an instructor that year that was a student intern from the University of Washington, named Miss Sullivan. She was a young white student. We all loved her because she was cute, but she also taught us the finer points of tennis. And so when we won the right to play for the championship, we got to go play at the Seattle Tennis Club. Now, she knew this fact, but we didn't, that blacks were never allowed in the tennis club unless they were servants, cooking in the kitchen. So we go down there in our little white shorts and white T-shirts that said Madrona on it. And so we're quickly ushered into the cafeteria, out of the view of everybody else. And so while we're in there waiting our turn to go out and play, a black guy comes in his long white kitchen skivvies, and he looks at us and he says, "What are y'all doing out here? You better get in the back and get your clothes on and get to work." Well, see, he thought we were the help. And we said, "No, man, we getting ready to go play tennis." And
when was this,
like,
in 67, you said?
This was, that I was thinking about, I was remembering this in 67 when I was sitting on the floor. This had happened years earlier when I was like probably 13 or 14 years old.
But then at that time, Arthur Ashe was already playing Davis Cup for the United States, right?
Oh, yeah. Arthur Ashe was already playing Davis Cup, but he was a singular player.
Oh, okay.
But the tennis clubs throughout the United States were still segregated. And so when it came our turn to go out and play, we went out there and beat the pants off the other teams and won the championship. And the trophies were sitting out there in the sunlight on the table. Never forget this. So the club leaders, the tennis club leaders, were supposed to be giving us our trophies in a little ceremony. They disappeared. They were nowhere to be seen. And so Miss Sullivan said, "Forget them. We'll give ourselves our own trophies." And so she gave us our trophies, and we took little bows on the court. Nobody was there. And we took them and left. But I recalled those things. And so by the time I showed up for my senior year, Christian, in the fall of 67, my afro was growing out. I told my dad no more haircuts. When I showed up at school, rather than looking like what we called a blippy, a black hippie, I was in dark pants, a dark blue jacket that had SNCC on the back, because I had become the co-chair of SNCC. So the shift had already started to occur. In fact, I was interviewed by the local newspaper on the Vietnam War and why it was an unjust war. My mom still has that article clipping. So we got to school, and we decided, me and my cohorts there, we decided we needed the Black Student Union. And so we went to the principal. The principal said, "Nah, you got a boys club," derogatory term, which they changed to men's club. And that's all you need. I said, "No, we don't." We said, "No, that doesn't represent us." And so we started to do some civil unrest. So in the pep assemblies, and because I was I played in the stage band, which is the jazz band for the pep assemblies. I was on the floor. So our first act of defiance was when the Pledge of Allegiance and the national anthem was played. I refused to play it, and I sat down, and my colleagues did in the stands. But because I was the one that was visible, I got kicked out of school. They called my mother up and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Dixon, this son of yours, he won't stand up and he won't play the national anthem." And she told them, "Well, I can't make him do anything. He's going to do what he wants to do." And so the following week, the band instructor, this is long before Colin Kaepernick, for those of you that don't know Colin Kaepernick. And so the following week, my band instructor told me that, "Well, if you're going to be in the band, you got to play." So I said, "Fine." So I played the national anthem sitting down. And of course, they called my mother up again. The following week, we did a chant after the national anthem was played. I said, "Bing, bing." my cohorts in the audience said bing bing. There were about 10 of them out there. They said bing bing, and I said bang bang, and they said bang bang, and I said 𝙏𝙬𝙤𝙦, and they said 𝙏𝙬𝙤. I said Black Power, and they said Black Power, and the whole audience, all the 800 students erupted in this screaming cheers and whatnot. So of course I got called in the principal's office again. So then we decided a boycott of classes. And when we organized the boycott, I'm sure the administration thought that it would be a handful of blacks that they would have to deal with, and it would be over. Well, what they didn't realize and what they underestimated was all of those white kids, all of the rest of those black kids, all those Latino kids, all those Asian kids. We had gone to school together. We had gone to grade school. We had gone to junior high. They were all our friends. So nobody went to class. No one. And so that did it. In fact, Principal Hannawalt would years later say that I almost gave him a heart attack. And which he ended up resigning.
So you learned at an early age that in order to facilitate change, you needed a broad coalition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so so that broad coalition, we became the first high school black student union on the West Coast of the United States. And so a few weeks, a couple of months later, in the spring of '68 now, this is where the pivotal point is. We were called by some students at Franklin High School, a sister high school, which was a rival high school, but a sister high school, because they were, black students were being kicked out of school for wearing afros, kicked out of school. If they got in a fight with the white student was sent back to class. The black student was expelled. So they called us up for help. And we went down there, and my brother, who was at the University of Washington, Aaron Dixon, with another guy by the name of Larry Gossett, who became a King County councilman for 30 years. They had started the BSU out at the UW, and they came. And we met with the students at Franklin across the street in the middle of the day at their eatery. Every school has a little eatery. High school has an eatery. And we were in the eatery, and they told us what was going on. And so right there in the moment, we said, okay, that's it. Let's go. There was no planning. Let's talk about it. We marched across the street and went into the principal's office and said, get out. We're taking over. Kicked the principal out, kicked the vice principal out, kicked all the secretaries, got the little persons and ran out, and we took over the office. We said, we're taking over the school. And we stayed in there overnight. The next morning when the bell rang, the phone rang, and it was the principal. And he said, look, you guys can have all your demands. Please give us our school back. And so they got a BSU at Franklin. They got their Black Studies program. Well, days later, I was in my geometry class back at Garfield, and the phone rang, and it was the office. And Mr. Narramore, my trigonometry teacher, said, Elmer, they want you in the office again. And I'm thinking, what? Okay, what did I do this time? And so I stepped out of the door, and there were two detectives there who read me my rights, handcuffed me, and took me to juvie for unlawful assembly. And they had arrested a couple other my classmates across the school. Aaron, my brother, and Larry Gossett, and a couple others at the UW were arrested and put in jail. They had rounded up who they thought were the central leaders of this new surge in movement, because within that hour, MLK was assassinated that same day. And that night, when my parents picked me up from juvie, my brother was still in jail because they couldn't get him out till the next day. As we drove home in silence, because their leader, the Prince of Peace, was murdered, assassinated. But at the same time, their two oldest sons, were in jail. And so I can't imagine what they were thinking, what they saw, potentially what was on the horizon. Days later, we traveled in a caravan, my brother and I, with other young people, to attend the West Coast Conference of Black Student Unions at San Francisco State University. And speaking that night was none other than Chairman Bobby Seale of the Black Panther Party. And Bobby Seale was mad. He was pissed off, and it was the most fiery speech that I'd ever heard. And the reason why he was mad is because the first member to join the Black Panther Party, little Bobby Hutton, 2 days after MLK was assassinated, was brutally murdered while in police custody, shot 30 times by 30 police bullets in the middle, right there in West Oakland, in the middle of the street. After he and Eldridge Cleaver had surrendered, after the cops had fired for an hour into this house, set it on fire, filled it with tear gas, and Eldridge had told little Bobby, strip down naked, we're going out to surrender. And little Bobby said, I'm not stripping down naked. I'll strip down to my skivvies. He was 17 years old. But Eldridge said, you know, you got to strip down naked or else they'll say you got a gun. But he wasn't going to strip all the way down naked. So Eldridge came out, and they saw that he was naked and couldn't say that he claimed that he had a gun. So they started immediately beating Eldridge. Little Bobby, with tear gas in his eyes, trying to come out of this, out of the smoke and tear gas. Someone pushed him, and he stumbled forward, and they said, he's got a gun. And they just opened up on him and shot him 30 times and murdered him. So Bobby Seale, Chairman Bobby Seale, after he finished his speech, you could see the blood, you could see the line drawn in the sand of the students in that room, for several hundred, most of them scared to death, and a few of us who made a beeline, us from Seattle, made a beeline to Bobby and said, we want to start a chapter of the Black Panther Party.
Okay.
And that's, well, that was the tip of it. The next day, because he invited us to little Bobby's funeral. The next day, when we drove across the Bay Bridge down into West Oakland, and I started seeing hundreds of black leather jacketed and beret men and women in the streets, in the park that was leading up to the church, and I thought to myself, this looks like a black army. And I remember as I'm walking to the church, I remember seeing Chairman Bobby in the field in the park there, in this area, and he was talking to a white guy that I recognized, and it was Marlon Brando. And see, Marlon Brando refused his Oscar back in that time. He had a Native American woman come up on the stage for him, and he was a staunch supporter of the party. And when I got into the church, we walked in, the walls were lined on all sides with young men and young women in leather jackets, berets, shotgun bandoleros across their chest, and shotguns. It was a surreal. I can't explain the image that I saw there and what it, the feeling that I got. And up in front of the church was little Bobby's coffin, and it was draped in a Panther flag. And so when it came time to view his remains, like Mamie Till, Mrs. Hutton wanted the community to see what had been done to her son, so she had its open casket. I remember when I filed by his casket and I looked in, there was this young revolutionary in his leather jacket, in his beret, with his Free Huey button on. And he was 17 years old, and I was 17 years old. And it was then, that point, that I knew I was ready to die for the people. And a committed revolutionary. Two weeks later, Bobby Seale came to our house, and as we launched the party, he told us we had to read 2 hours a day. We had to read, we had to attend PE classes, political education classes, at least once or twice a week. We had to own 2 weapons and 1,000 rounds of ammunition because he said they're coming for you. And that was the summer of '68. We were the first chapter formed outside of the state of California, and J. Edgar Hoover named us the #1 threat to the internal security of the United States. And then they were coming after us. But we, Fred Hampton, who was murdered and is in the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, Fred Hampton launched what became known as the Rainbow Coalition. That was not Jesse Jackson. And so we had coalitions with white groups, the Young Patriots, not these patriots running around here now, the Patriot Party, the Young Lords, they were Puerto Ricans, the Brown Berets, the Red Guard, AIM, the American Indian Movement, We had coalitions across the full spectrum of the rainbow because the Black Panther Party had a multicultural platform. So all of those things that were part of my growing up, even though I was now a Black Panther, defending the Black community and stimulating revolution, we also were in a coalition with other groups of color and white folks stimulating revolution in their communities as well. And so it was that multicultural platform that eventually, landed me as an interculturalist and a trainer that I've been for the last 34 years.
So I'm going to ask first of all, thank you for sharing those memories, because I think it's important for not just us here, but anyone who's watching this to get a little refresher on what went down in those days. Now, I want to fast forward into now, because the events that you described that activated you, right? They sound much alike the events that we're witnessing today. So 50 plus years later, looking at your legacy of work, at your experiences of growing up and going through the motions, not only through the motions, but doing the work in your field, how far have we come?
Frederick Douglass, when he was turning John Brown down, John Brown was the abolitionist who wanted to free the slaves and was killed at Harper's Ferry. Actually, right. He was attacked at Harper's Ferry and later hung.
Yep.
He was seen as too violent or too direct in his action. And John Brown said, we got to free the slaves now. And Frederick Douglass said to him, it's going to take up to five generations or longer before you will see systemic change. And we're past the fifth generation. And the same atrocities are being committed. A young Black man was murdered in Chicago at the hands of police, 13 years old, 2 days ago, with his hands raised in the air. Not to mention the young Black man who was shot supposedly mistakenly, rather than with a taser, but with her gun, because he had air fresheners in his car. That's how far we've come. Not very far at all. Yes, we have Oprah Winfrey that's a billionaire. That's one person. We've got a long way to go, my friend.
So what is the baton you're passing on to the next generation of revolutionaries, of people fighting for social justice? What is it that the next generation will have to do? What are the lessons learned?
One is to make sure you have a platform and a program. I remember when Black Lives Matter first started, they had no platform. They had no program. I was encouraged when I saw this last movement that happened last spring, that they actually had a 5-pointer, the things that they wanted.
Right.
So and I used to tell them that, I'm sure others did too. So I was encouraged to see that they had established that. So that's a beginning. But I want to tell you another story, and then I've got to end because I've got another interview coming up here in seconds. I've been asked on a number of occasions in the last couple of years to speak to second and third graders, also seventh and eighth graders, but the second and third graders. And I was asked to speak at a school in Bellevue, Washington, which is across the lake from Seattle, in an upper crust white community, primarily white community. Well, Seattle is a white community. Seattle is one of the whitest cities in America. But if you can get whiter than that, it's Bellevue across the water. And so
you got to come to Atlanta, Elmer. I'm telling you.
Spirit Ridge Elementary. And so when I get into this school, first thing I noticed was there was these posters on the wall that said Panther Principles, and I said, God, shit. But then I realized that the Panther was their school mascot. I said, okay, settle down. Don't get too excited. So I get into the classroom, and there's about 20 or 30 kids sitting on the floor. And before we could get started, another teacher comes in with her. Can my class come in? I said, certainly, bring them in. She goes, there's about 60 kids sitting down there. And I get down close to the ground, close to them. And I'm not going to be lecturing them. They're going to be asking me questions because their teachers had already explained to them, and they had learned about the 10-point program. They had learned about our survival programs. We didn't just have programs because they were programs. They were what we called community survival programs pending revolution. People needed to survive while they were while revolution was pending. And the very first program that we had was a police alert patrol, where we followed cops around with guns and law books and stopped them from murdering people in the street. And so I was so honored to be with all these kids. And so the very first question out of this little white, blonde, blue-eyed kid's mouth, he couldn't be more than 7 or 8 years old. He said to me, with all the muster and excitement that he could get in his voice, he said, "What was it like being on the police alert patrol?" And I was like blown away. That here's this kid in Bellevue, Washington, asking me about the police alert patrol, not in a way that was like why would you do that, but what was it like? Right. Holding them accountable. And so when I look at the future, it is those young kids and exposing the truth to them, the true nature of who we were as an organization, freedom fighters, not terrorists, but freedom fighters, and the true nature of this decadent American society. I often refer kids to read a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. If you want to find a terrorist, look up Christopher Columbus. Yes. There was a terrorist. And so exposing the true nature of this society so that people can own it and then move away from it. But you can't move away from it if you're still hiding from it. And Americans are still hiding from it. I often tell people when I go to Europe, I feel more at home in Europe than I do in my home country. That's because America has not owned up to its history of racism and slavery and oppression.
There's another book that would fit right in there that's called Howard Zinn's People's History of America.
Yeah.
That's also
Europe has done its own dirt.
Oh yeah.
But at least they've owned up to, like, Leopold in Belgium, and how brutal he was. And so they've owned up to those things. And so America needs to own up to its things. Now I've got to go, you guys, because I've got a client waiting for me.
Yeah.
But
Elmer, thank you.
A real
thank
pleasure.
you for being here.
Yeah.
And I had this as a banner on my Facebook for a long time until my wife got mad at me for being so outspoken. It says, "Nothing will change until you own your shit, America." And I think that's, unless we own what we do, unless we own up to our shortcomings, we won't facilitate change.
Right on. All right. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you, sir.
Happy weekend. Thanks for your work.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's stick on here, because I think this is great. I mean, we could have gone on for a long time with Elmer. I mean, we've watched him. I think he talked about coalition, right? We've seen Elmer deliver this message not only here in the US, but also in other places in the world. And personally, I've watched him do it in Dublin and Belgium, and with audiences that he goes and teaches. And so this message is not just for the US, it's not for people, but it's building coalitions around the world with inclusion, intentional inclusion, as he so likes to put it, which I think is such an important thing. And that brings it also into the realm of the coalitions with younger generations. And as he said, going to the children, telling them about this history, informing them of it, and getting them excited about understanding it, not scared of it, but excited about understanding it and taking it into a new realm. And then, hopefully they grow up with a new awareness. Yeah.
And I've made this comparison before, and some of you may have heard me speak to this topic before, and it may get old for some of you. My experience of growing up as a Generation Xer in Germany has taught me that when a society is deliberately, intentionally facing its historic demons and is addressing these old wounds, and most importantly, honoring the pain of the victims, the pain of those who were mistreated. When that happens, the feeling of shame can be processed and can give way and make way to an emotion of obligation and accountability for today. Because I think by ignoring one's past and trying to make it go away, and by trying to sweep it under the rug of history, we're not clearing away the pain. We're simply perpetuating it in other forms. And I'm a strong believer, if we want to accomplish equality, if we want to accomplish social justice, we need to collectively look in the mirror and acknowledge that what has been and that what isn't working now, in order to have a constructive future-paced dialogue. Everything else is just remaining in one's own silos and trying to helplessly defend the erroneous positions that have been handed down for generations. But I'm happy that we have people like Elmer.
Preach. Absolutely. No, we're honored to have people like Elmer in our realm, and we invite you to do so too. You can find him and his story in many different places. This is just one, and he's got many other stories. I just think about the Black Panther Party themselves. I mean, I grew up with a bias of understanding or thinking of the Black Panther movement as a very revolutionary, but if not kind of militant organization that was all about kind of violent revolution. But when he speaks about this wonderful kind of community spirit that it was built out of, and the coalitions that it built in serving communities by giving away food and community programs, it was about really just kind of building up pride and establishing a level of just self-confidence in the community, right? Against this kind of, I'll call it this Holocaust of oppression that is kind of still here today, right? And so we can only bow our heads at the service that he's put in, and many others like him, and others that have actually died in that cause, right? And
right.
that kind of thing. So, every yeah.
My invitation to those of you watching this, or those of you engaged in bridge building dialogues, always remember that hurt people hurt people. And unless we address the pain of hurt, and unless we care for those that have been hurt, the infliction of pain will continue. So our job is to take care of the pain and not perpetuate it. And whatever avenue you find for yourself to do so, you have allies in us, and we would love to talk to you.
Amen. Thank you, sir. That was wonderful. Thank you, Elmer, for joining us. We probably have to do it again because there's a whole bunch of other stories, but that's great. So this is Two Chaps, Many Cultures, episode 189, Friday, and have a wonderful weekend, sir. And
same to you.
We will see you next week, of course. We'll be back.
Ciao for now.
All right, bye.